Darwin's ideas were very radical when he first published them, but over the centuries, scientists have found a lot of evidence to support the theory of descent with modification. So, in this section, we're going to look at several lines of evidence that help support this theory of descent with modification or evolution. A fossil is an imprint of part of an organism or an entire organism that is preserved in rock. The soft parts of dead organisms usually decay quickly, but the hard parts can be fossilized if they're in the right environment. Um, on the top here, you can see a fossilized skull of one of the early relatives of humans, named Homo erectus. In the middle, we have fossilized shells of ammonites. Most fossils are found in sedimentary rock, like this in the Grand Canyon, which form into layers called strata. The older the rock is, the lower it is. So these strata at the bottom are older than the strata at the top. As rock settles, new sediment is placed on top of it, which compacts the rock below, which forms strata over long periods of time. The deeper the fossils are found in the earth, the further back they are from in the history of the earth. Sometimes fossils are an entire organism. An example of an entire organism could be a mosquito that becomes cased in amber, which is just fossilized tree sap, or a woolly mammoth who got frozen in ice. The fossil record is incomplete. It's an incomplete history of Earth. The reason it's incomplete is that there were many soft body organisms that were never fossilized. There are organisms that didn't live in environments that were favorable to preservation. So even if they maybe were hard bodied, they didn't ever get fossilized either. There are fossils that did form that have been warped or destroyed over time. And there are also fossils that we have yet to find. And so there could be fossil evidence in the soil of organisms that humans just haven't found yet. One way that fossils help support the theory of evolution is that they show these transitional forms. Whales are a mammal, and they are a mammal that has returned to the water from an ancestor that used to live on land. And it was hypothesized that they evolved from four-legged mammals. In the 1970s, fossils were supported that helped to support this hypothesis. On the right, you can see a series of fossils of hind limbs or back legs over a period of time. So the bones of the hind limb show gradual changes over 50 million years. And these changes accumulate slowly. And so this is likely what an organism might have looked like that whales could have been ancestral to whales, where they have this hip and femur and then tibia and then foot. And then as they started to get more into an aquatic environment, you can start to see there's webbing in the toes. This hind limb changes. The orientation and the direction changes. And then as these mammals started to live fully aquatic lives, they didn't need their hind limbs as much. And so the bones start to get smaller and smaller until you get to the bones that you find in an actual whale today, which are just remnants of that hip bone, the pelvis. So the ancestors that the modern day whales are derived from are now extinct. So we wouldn't be able to see this trend of changes in hip and leg bones over time without the presence of fossils. A homology is a structure that is similar among different species because it is inherited from a common ancestor. So this would be like if you and your siblings all have the same color eyes because they're inherited from your parents. Evolution is a process in which small changes are made over long periods of time. This means that organisms that are closely related probably have similar structures. And over time, these structures may even change to the point where they function differently, but still have the same underlying pattern. So one example of this is homologous structures is a vertebrate forelimb. So on the bottom, you can see four forelimbs. We have the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat. So think about the bones in your arm. The humerus is in the arm, the radius and ulna are in the forearm, and then you have carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges in your hand. The cat forearm actually has the same bones. They're shaped a little bit differently, and they function a little bit differently because cats walk different than us. They use their forelimbs for locomotion. A whale also has all of these bones, but they are shaped to form a flipper for swimming. And a bat has all of these bones as well, in the same order, just shaped differently again, to be light and thin to make a part of a wing for flight. But the presence of the same pattern of bones, humerus, ulnar radius, carpal, metacarpal, phalanges, means that all of these animals probably came from a common ancestor who had all of these bones in that order also. We can also use DNA evidence to support evolutionary relationships nowadays. The more similar the DNA of two organisms, the more closely related they are. Sometimes even animals that look very different as adults can have homologies as an embryo. So look at the picture in the top right. Can you tell which is which? One is a human embryo and the other is a chicken embryo. Both of them have homologous structures. They both have a postanal tail, so you can see the tail here and here, and pharyngeal pouches, so those are in the throat. The one on the left is the chicken, and the human is on the right. They will go through many changes as they develop that will make them look very different. But the fact that their embryos look so similar support the fact that we evolved from a common ancestor with birds. They both came from an ancestor who had an embryo that looked similar. Many times evolution results in a vestigial structure. This is something that no longer functions the way it used to. It might have had important function for an ancestor, but it no longer does. An example is the hind limb bones found in whales. So whales don't really need hip bones, they're not using them for locomotion or walking. They were important for walking and swimming in their ancestors, but they no longer function in locomotion. Snakes, some species of snakes also still have vestigial hind limbs that they no longer use for walking. An evolutionary tree can also be called a phylogenetic tree. It shows a pattern of common ancestors over time. So homologous characteristics or structures can be shown on these trees. Characters that evolved a long time ago can be seen shared with many branches of the tree. For example, the trait of having tetrapod limbs. So this trait is right here before the number 2. Tetra means 4, and pod means foot. So a tetrapod is any organism that has 4 limbs. So if you look at the tree, all of the organisms after this branching, amphibians, mammals, snakes and lizards, crocodiles, ostriches, and birds, all have 4 limbs. Whereas the ones that branch off before this trait develops, the lungfish, don't have 4 limbs, and so they're not considered tetrapods. Traits that have been evolved more recently are shared with fewer groups. For example, a recent trait is feathers, which is only shared amongst the groups that have ancestors from there, ostriches, hawks, and other birds. Each time the tree branches represents a common ancestor that no longer exists. So these are those numbers, these branches. Think of this like a family tree, but instead of just a few generations, it's over hundreds of millions of years. The organisms on the right are the ones that are still alive today. And these branching points are organisms that are no longer alive. An evolutionary tree is a hypothesis, or a guess, based on observations that we have made. Some are supported by a lot of evidence, like this tree of the tetrapods. Some trees are not supported by much evidence. When new evidence is found all of the time, that changes the layouts of many evolutionary trees. New protists are being found all of the time, and molecular biologists are constantly updating the phylogenetic trees of Protista to reflect those changes.